Hey team, this is a chapter from Peter Beilhart's book, Trotskyism and the Transition to Socialism. The chapter that I'm reading today is titled Philosophy in Transition, C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya. Trotsky's arguments about transition are constructed in the shadow of the Soviet experience. The same is true of the arguments of his followers, even if some of them reverse his understanding of the significance of the Russian experience or shade their interpretations with more nuance. The thinkers examined in this second part all emerged directly from the political milieu of organized Trotskyism. Mandel and Deutscher, who remained closer to orthodox Trotskyism, will be discussed in subsequent chapters. C.L.R. James, J.R. Johnson, which is his name as part of the Forrest Johnson tendency, and Raya Dunayevskaya, Freddie Forrest, were in comparison the central heretics of the Johnson-Forrest, quote, state capitalist, end quote, tendency, which worked within American Trotskyism between 1941 and 1951. James and Dunayevskaya left organized Trotskyism in 1951 and collaborated on the correspondence committees from 1953 to 1955 when they split. Dunayevskaya then established News and Letters, which, with its newspaper of the same name, still functions today. While remaining politically active, James did not have a formal organizational following, though there were enthusiasts for his thought grouped around journals like Radical America and Cultural Correspondence. Both James and Dunayevskaya had collaborated with Trotsky in the earlier period. James participated in the founding conference of the Fourth International as British delegate and was responsible for raising discussion of the Negro problem in the Fourth International. Dunayevskaya assisted the operations of the Bulletin of the Opposition and worked as secretary to Trotsky in Mexico between 1937 and 1938, breaking with him over the Hitler-Stalin Pact, as Raya Dunayevskaya refused any longer to follow Trotsky's defense of the USSR. The Johnson-Forrest tendency arose within and against the Workers' Party, which was associated with Max Shachtman and Shachtman's analysis of the USSR's, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. Dunayevskaya and James developed an alternative explanation of the USSR. They developed the other half of the socialism/capitalism dyad, arguing that the Russian regime was state capitalist in nature. Both Dunayevskaya and James were philosophers with a special interest in Hegel. Dunayevskaya translated the first English versions of both Marx's Paris manuscripts and Lenin's philosophical notebooks. Both thinkers made detailed analyses of the Russian economy. Both were to take on the characteristically Trotskyist enthusiasm for Lenin and Lenin's regime. While Dunayevskaya's interests are wide-ranging, her works, notably Marxism and Freedom and Philosophy and Revolution, are characterized by thematic unity and clarity of style. James, in contrast, has interest even more diverse than Trotsky. His writings include a book on cricket, Beyond a Boundary, historical analysis, The Black Jacobins, novels and literary criticism, particularly on Melville. In contrast to Dunayevskaya, whose political interests still have a distinctly North American orientation, James became a publicist for the Pan-African movement. As intellectuals and activists, James and Dunayevskaya are therefore both complementary and contrasting. Their criticisms of Trotsky, their philosophical interest, and their own analyses of transition provide reflections of some of Trotsky's positions as well as revealing the novelties of their own developments. Their major contribution, the argument about state capitalism, remains one of the most influential of radical interpretations of the Soviet state. As one of the most innovative variants of Trotskyism, this argument affords a clear view of the libertarian limits to which Trotskyist thinking can be pushed. James will be dealt with first, then Dunayevskaya. James's assessment of Trotsky and Lenin. As on a related topic, I have a piece by Matthew Quest on here titled, I can't remember actually what the title is, but the historical problem, it's like something to the effect of like historical problems with James's understanding of the relation between Lenin and like the decline of Soviet democracy in the Soviet Union. James's position on Trotsky commences with the problem of Trotsky's conceptual rigidity. According to James, Trotsky's equation of, quote, nationalized property, end quote, with, quote, the workers' state, end quote, in the revolution betrayed, indicates that Trotsky would rather let Marxism perish than change its obsolete categories. Trotsky's limit is that he attempts to think through new problems such as the question of the nature of the USSR within old forms. James applies Hegelian categories to the criticism of Trotsky. Trotsky remains on the level of persistent, capital U, understanding, and it is this which explains Trotsky's fixation. Trotskyism remains fixed within categories which no longer exist. Unlike Lenin, Trotsky failed to consider the Hegelian legacy of Marxism. James' criticism is both general and specific. Quote, Trotskyism, completely failed to study page 244 of the Logic, end quote. That's Hegel's Logic. And therefore avoided coming to grips with the philosophical foundation of its mistaken ways. Instead, Trotsky remains imprisoned within understanding, unable to grasp the fact that understanding is merely the preparatory step to reason. Trotsky's scorn for the concrete drives him into the arms of Menshevism, where Trotsky can develop only, quote, thin abstractions, without content, end quote. Quoting Hegel, James proceeds to demonstrate his case, quote, understanding takes the concrete and makes the concrete into a universal. Understanding, therefore, sees the universal only as determinate universality, and therefore the concrete, the individual, which it has elevated into this position, has taken upon itself the tremendous task of determining itself, self-relation. For this, the concrete thus pushed up into the situation of universal is quite unified, end quote. Quote, does this sound abstract? James interpolates. Fuck. I accidentally lost my spot. Come on, you son of a gun. Christ on a fucking cross. Sorry, let me find where I was. I have to repeat that quote, that Hegel quote. Quoting Hegel, James proceeds to demonstrate his case. Quote, understanding takes the concrete and makes the concrete into a universal. It therefore sees the universal only as determinate universality, and therefore the concrete, the individual, which it has elevated into this position, has taken upon itself the tremendous task of determining itself, self-relation. For this, the concrete, thus pushed up into the situation of universal, is quite unfitted, end quote. Quote, does this sound abstract, end quote. James interpolates, quote, not to me. We have seen nationalized property, the concrete in Russia, taken and pushed into the position of universal, end quote. Trotsky's method, according to James, is then to take the being of the finite and make the finite into an absolute. Trotsky takes a moment of the universal and transforms that moment into the universal itself. Quote, whence these tears, end quote, so speaks James in evangelical despair of Trotsky's philosophical misadventures. For James, Lenin becomes critical reason incarnate. Trotsky, in comparison, was wrong, quote, on every serious point, end quote. Yet James' criticisms of Trotsky are single-minded. He always concentrates on the category of nationalized property. Trotsky's failure is then restated as the false universalization of the moment of nationalized property in the plan. Property for James is mere appearance. What are essential are the real production relations operative in the USSR. James explains his argument in a review of the Revolution Betrayed, quote, after 10 years, end quote. Trotsky's central focus, that's actually on this YouTube channel, so check that out. Trotsky's central focus is on planning. His interest is in consumption rather than in production, inequality rather than in the nature of the prevailing social relations. James turns the early Marx against Trotsky. As Marx had it, alienated labor precedes private property rather than vice versa. Trotsky's argument is held to be deficient, in that Trotsky's argument concentrates on the formal or legal dimensions of the USSR to the exclusion of its active labor process. That would be a similar criticism that Cornelius Castoriadis will raise. This is an argument common to James and Dunayevskaya. The view is one of society from below, through the prism of labor, which is seen as the vital determinant of social classification. Though hardly critical of Trotsky, James nevertheless concedes that Trotsky's theory is the source of his own understanding. Like Stalinism, Trotskyism for James is essential and rational, though both theories are now obsolete. James recognizes that Trotsky is essential to the progress of Marxist thought because error is the dynamic of truth. In what then does James's own Trotskyism consist? James's specific endorsements of Trotsky are few. In his orthodox Trotskyist phase, James accepts the principle of uneven development, but retitles the principle of uneven development the law of historical compensation, transforming backwardness into a dynamic of social transition. James judges Trotsky a, quote, great executive, an organizer and administrator of the first rank, end quote, and follows Trotskyist tradition in praising Trotsky's analysis of fascism. Beyond these tacit endorsements, there exists a series of affinities with Trotsky, a love of Lenin, a belief in dialectical materialism's capacity to function as an epistemological master key, and its teleological outcome manifested in an extreme optimism, anticipating inevitable evolution. James deems Lenin superior to Trotsky because Lenin speaks of Hegel in his philosophical notebooks of 1914 to 16. A fundamental import is ascribed to Lenin's philosophical, quote, turn, end quote. Lenin's political shifts, for example, the taking up of the slogan of, quote, turn the imperialist war into civil war, end quote, are seen by James as philosophical, quote, leaps, end quote. This judgment corresponds with the argument that Trotsky remains on the level of understanding, never reaching the Leninist/Hegelian apogee of reason. Lenin, in comparison, can, in James's view, make rapid political transitions which are philosophical in source and nature. Lenin also has, precisely what Trotsky lacks, a real universal. Socialism, the, quote, universal, end quote, is, quote, looked for somewhere to place itself, end quote. Trotsky is of no help here, as Trotsky is obsessed with a false universalization, state property. Lenin's State and Revolution fills the void as philosophical prophecy, as new universal. James regards Lenin's political practice as an attempt to implement practically state and revolution. James does not seem to have contemplated the category, quote, bad abstraction, end quote, for there could be nothing more fantastic than the project of attempting to realize state and revolution, with its maxim, every cook can govern, in the Russia of 1917. Lenin had more sense and less dialectics than this. Quote, peace, bread, and land, end quote, was the terminological currency of a politician, not a philosopher. James, however, interprets Leninism as a utopian theory of universal significance. Himself universalizing the particular, James deems Lenin's articles and methods in Russia between 1917 and 1923 to be, quote, the greatest possible source of theoretical understanding and insight into the world of today, end quote. Like Dunayevskaya, James presents Lenin as a philosophical, political radical who had solutions for all problems. Avoiding problems of complexity and scale, and in a sense reflecting Lenin's own naivety in State and Revolution, James argues as though the classical image of Athens could be materialized in the Russia of 1917. One second. New section. Hegel and the Dialectics of Certainty in James. James' admittedly sophisticated reading of Hegel in Notes on Dialectics is qualified and compromised by his acceptance of the laws of dialectical materialism. James applies the historicist Hegel to the history of the working class movement. The presupposition is that Hegelian logic can reveal where the labor movement is going and how the labor movement turns, splits, victories, and losses fit into the picture. History for James is teleological by definition. Because reason negates, reason must create. Each object has a universal logic which expresses that object's self with peculiar manifestation. Each object has a universal logic which expresses itself with peculiar manifestations in particular examples. Even a house, says James, has dialectical movements of a house's own. Politics is understood as the movement towards the true and good. The real is rational, therefore, in the sense that the real provides the precondition for the rational. Dialectics is seen as future-oriented and speculative. Contradiction is conceived internally as a principle of self-development. All development, not only philosophical, but also directly political, takes place by internal self-movement. A notion of contradiction as imminent self-development is thus inscribed in history. The future of the proletariat, for example, is conceived as coming from within itself. Socialism for James is inevitable, quote, as a necessity of logical thinking in dialectical terms, end quote. Reason is held to inherent things, and socialism is seen as political reason. Thus, quote, under the stress of this violent pressure back and forth, for neither can give way, the organism boils over into the notion. It knows itself for what it is. That stage is not far off for the proletariat, end quote. Socialism for James is simply inevitable. Its inevitability is a, quote, consciously constructed necessity of thought, end quote. More, socialist thinking is impossible without the presumption of inevitability. Quote, the inevitability of socialism is the inevitability of the negation of the negation, the third and most important law of the dialectic, end quote. Trotsky would probably dispute little of this, yet Trotsky did not explicitly Hegelianize his own understanding of dialectical materialism. James's assessment of Trotsky as inadequately Hegelian notwithstanding, there seems to be little substantial difference between Trotsky's more primitive and James's more sophisticated philosophy. Yet even with his additional sophistication, James is still capable of crudities far more reminiscent of Trotsky than of Hegel. Like Trotsky, James engages generative metaphor and implicitly divides knowledge into, quote, proletarian science, end quote, and, quote, bourgeois science, end quote. On occasion, James's writing style is even more oratorical than Trotsky's. Indeed, in some places, it is evangelical in style. James's reaction to the criticism of orthodox Marxism is as hostile as Trotsky's own. Sidney Hook, for example, is accused, with special reference to The Hero in History, which I guess is a book by Sidney Hook, of nothing less than philosophical crimes, for disputing the possibility of empirically verifying the doctrine that stages develop inevitably from one another. James's argument against Hook proceeds by means of theoretical guilt, by ascribing association. James presents Hook's argument as a reinvention of Düring, to be automatically disqualified in advance because Eugen Düring has already been dealt with by Engels. Rather, more is learnt here about Düring's limitations than Hook's. As an exercise in obfuscation, James's procedure indicates something about James, whose willful association with the father of the dialectics of nature is no accident. The question of James' relation to Engels raises another question, that of his relation to Hegel and to Marx, for he seems to identify the two. James attempts to rethink Hegel's logic through the prism of the history of the working class movement. Though in such a metaphorical juxtaposition, it never becomes clear whether Hegel or that history has priority. James's attitude to Hegel, as to Marx, is reverential. The question of the difference between Marx and Hegel, for example, in the question of world spirit, is consistently avoided. By substituting society, Marx, for religion, Hegel, James achieves the long-sought quest of, quote, putting Hegel back on his feet, end quote. The self-realization of spirit in Hegel is recast as the Marxian project of the self-realization of mankind. In this kind of eschatology, the result produced is simply Hegel inverted. The philosophy of history proposed for Marx is not substantially different from Hegel's. Further, James falls into the common error of universalizing Hegel's dialectic of master and slave. As Gadamer has pointed out, that's Hans-Georg Gadamer, who's like a German philosopher. I think he's associated with hermeneutics. I think he's like one of his big ideas is the hermeneutic circle, which is like a kind of like a dialectical method of interpreting texts, but I'm not exactly sure. I might be making that up. As Gadamer has pointed out, Marx himself illegitimately transfers Hegel's metaphor of master and slave from its original feudal setting into bourgeois society. The conclusion to be drawn is that neither the act of labor nor the dialectic of master and slave is any Promethean telos. James has less to say about Marx. Predictably, James is drawn to the apocalyptic in Marx, speaking of the penultimate chapter of Capital, Volume 1, as, quote, one of the greatest triumphs of the human mind, end quote, as it represents what James calls, after Engels, quote, the invading socialist society, end quote. Marx is portrayed figuratively as the most idealistic of materialists, while Hegel is presented as the most materialistic of idealists. Hegel and Marx are presented analogically, even interchangeably. Marx appears as Hegel materialized. James therefore conforms to the broader tendency characteristic of Marxism to conflate Hegel and Marx, but in a peculiarly metaphorical way. James collapses all intellectual practices into the practice of philosophy, or rather perhaps sees them as emanating from philosophy. Even literature and cricket are subsumed to philosophical judgment in the panlogistic purview. James uses, for example, Heidegger's concept Dasein to explain West Indian literature. The parallel is forced, and, as James admits, results from the coincidental in his reading habits. As in the treatment of Hegel and Marx, a series of parallel images is thrown up, which explains very little of the objects being compared. Despite these idiosyncrasies, what is clear is that James views philosophy as a substratum in all discourse. Like other, quite separate strands of Trotskyism, such as the Helyites in Britain, James sees philosophy as the essence or fundament of politics. Hegel is then indented by James as the arbiter of all argument. James indeed presumes that all thinking can be subsumed to Hegel's threefold, ascending differentiation between common sense, understanding, and dialectic. Dialectical materialism here becomes the master language. Hegel's logic becomes the Bible of socialism ascendant. In historiography, James also follows the argument put by Hegel and especially by Plekhanov. Freedom is the materialization of necessity. Great men, from Wilson Harris to Melville and Garfield Sobers, are represented as bearers of the zeitgeist. I don't know who these people are. Wilson Harris. Sir Theodore Wilson Harris was a Guyanese writer. Wilson Harris initially wrote poetry, but subsequently became a novelist and essayist. Wilson Harris's writing style is often said to be abstract and densely metaphorical, and his subject matter wide-ranging. Harris is considered one of the most original and innovative voices in post-war literature in English. I don't know who Garfield Sobers is. Garfield Sobers. Garfield Sobers is a cricket player from Trinidad. from Barbados. Anyway, where am I? In historiography, James also follows the argument put by Hegel and especially by Plekhanov: freedom is the materialization of necessity. Great men, from Wilson Harris to Melville and Garfield Sobers, are represented as bearers of the zeitgeist. Politics and history alike are emissions of spirit, and spirit itself is socialism. The question of transition. James on state capitalism as the alternative to Trotsky's explanation of the USSR. For James, unlike Trotsky, the mole has yet to surface or resurface in the USSR. Production relations on the factory floor are, for James, the telling feature of the nature of Soviet society, not its legally, quote, socialist, end quote, property form. Production relations in the USSR mirror those in the United States, quote, an assembly line in Moscow is an assembly line in Detroit, end quote. Both the US and the USSR are seen as materializations of a broader worldwide tendency to capitalization. Quote, Ford's regime before unionization is the prototype of production relations in fascist Germany and Stalinist Russia, end quote. In Fordism can be seen the embryo of totalitarianism. Elsewhere, James simply calls the USSR a fascist state. Or argues, like Bruno Ricci, that totalitarianism and fascism are species of one-party state capitalism, the distinguishing feature of the age. I just put up actually a piece by James called "The USSR is a Fascist State Capitalism" from the 40s, I believe, like early 1940s. The Stalinist bureaucracy is understood as the American bureaucracy taken to its ultimate conclusion. The development of the Russian labor process is viewed as the, quote, telescopic reenactment of the development of U.S. production, end quote. Stakhanovism is presented as the universal model of the form of leadership appropriate to such systems of domination. The law of value is taken to be operative in the USSR, concretizing its definition as state capitalist, a capitalist regime with control centralized in the hands of a single state owner. The introduction of the conveyor belt system in 1943, James argues, corresponds with the admission by the Soviet economist Leontiev that the law of value was operative in the USSR. Quote, state property and total planning are nothing else but the complete subordination of the proletariat to capital, end quote. Soviet planning itself is but a form of capitalist rationality. Trotsky's capitalism/socialism couplet is reduced into one. Existing, quote, socialism, end quote, is capitalism. Against Trotsky, James regards the concept of labor as prior to that of property. For James, the mere fact of a labor force compelled to sell its labor power, quote, automatically, end quote, indicates the existence of the capitalist system of accumulation. Soviet bureaucrats are therefore seen as bearers of a structure which makes them the functional equivalents of Western capitalists. The proviso is added that the USSR is not the same as the USA, only similar. But whatever the difference is, quote, the fundamental laws of capitalism, end quote, quote, the fundamental laws of capitalism operate, end quote, in the USSR. Those laws remain undetailed. It can be deduced that they spring from the existence of wage labor, and therefore mirror those alleged to be at work in the US. How did state capitalism emerge in Russia? James argues that the degeneration of the Russian Revolution, evidenced by the 1921-22 trade union debates, quote, announced the birth of modern state capital, end quote, in totalitarian form. 1921-2 trade union debates. What was I going to say? It would have been still while Lenin was alive. The relationship of Stalinism to Leninism is to be explained by the dialectical principle of the unity of opposites. democracy calls forth totalitarianism. Stalinism is seen as a logically necessary response to the Russian Revolution. Quote, precisely because the Russian Revolution assumed a new quality in attempting to establish a universal democracy. The Russian counter-revolution assumes a new quality of universal barbarism, end quote. The philosophy of history implicit here is an ironical theorem of progress through retrogression. Tracing the genesis of Stalinism back in European history, James argues that state capitalism is the saving grace of the French Revolution. Menshevism is considered by James to grow into Stalinism as germ grows into plant. This growth is taken to represent the evolution of the petty bourgeoisie, whose power in James' view lies at the root of the French Revolution, Menshevism and Stalinism. The Communist Party is explained as the form for which the petty bourgeoisie provides the content. James's peculiar philosophical rhetoric prevents him from engaging a specific theory of the genesis of Stalinism. What is suggested instead is a perverse odyssey in which the petty bourgeoisie materializes itself in all the known evils of modern history, constructing its road to class power on the bones of humanity. James in this applies an interesting twist to Trotsky's own perspective. In which the directionless petty bourgeoisie is merely buffeted between the two major classes. Despite itself, the only class lacking in historic vocation manages now to determine the character of modern history. The relation of this theorem to that of inevitable socialism in James's work is not resolved. The broader possibilities of the historical horizon are obscured. The status of the, quote, inevitable socialism, end quote, to which James has such a basic commitment seems to be cast in doubt. James' assurances that chapter 32 of Marx's Capital will still be lived out are no more convincing than the original, perhaps even less so given his inverse theodicy philosophy of history. James makes no differentiation between the way essence works itself out in Russia, Germany, or the world at large. Quote, the proletariat must be revolutionary, end quote, says James. Quote, the proletariat must keep on being revolutionary, or the proletariat is reduced to nothing and a substitute takes its place, end quote. As in Trotsky's theory, capital H history here both sets the tasks and solves the tasks, punishing the reticent at will. History, quote, does it faster, end quote, at the expense of the proletariat if necessary. James takes his leave to return to the logic in order to solve the problem of Stalinism. James's proposal for socialist transition. Despite this dismal scenario for mankind, the certain outcome of socialism is still held by James to be inevitable. Indeed, James sees the future already existing in the present in the form of the, quote, invading socialist society, end quote. It is almost as though socialism already exists, just beneath the social surface, only its arrival has not been declared. James cannot therefore face, let alone answer, the question of transition, as in Trotsky. A residual guarantee of faith always exists to cheer those faced by defeats on all fronts. James's certainty surfaces again and again. In one place, for example, he argues that socialism is inherent in the hearts and minds of American industrial workers. More, the very structure of modern society breeds autonomy in people. Revolutionary activity, says James, is the proletariat's nature. State capitalism itself produces the social and psychological needs which compel the populace to take hold of the state itself. Quote, objective necessity compels the proletariat to make permanent the great creative impulses from 1848 to 1917, end quote. The new universal, the abolition of the distinction between party and mass, is already on the agenda in 1948. Quote, in the advanced countries we are not far from it in actuality, end quote. James anticipates the arrival of socialism before 1958. The passing of the decade is necessary in order to close the gap between idea and actuality. Manifestations of these philosophical transitions are taken by James to present themselves throughout the 1940s. In America, James follows Trotsky in viewing the CIO as an assent mass party rather than a union. In Italy and France, the prominence of the communist parties is taken as a signal of impending revolution. A similar situation exists in Britain for James. In Britain, no serious Marxist can doubt the revolutionary nature of the working class. James's prospectus for revolution was not fulfilled by the 50s. As a result, his revolutionary attention was turned elsewhere, reversing the Hegelian view of history as a process with an epicenter shifting from Orient to Occident and reviving his long-established Pan-Africanism. James turned to Africa and the Third World in search of the revolutionary vanguard. Here, finally, James presents the African anti-colonial movement as potential detonators of other social movements. In Nkrumah, it's Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Nkrumah is seen by James as acting out the ideas of Marx and Lenin. Accra, I'm not sure who that is, I gotta look that up. Okay. Accra is the capital and largest city of Ghana. Nkrumah is seen by James as acting the ideas of Marx and Lenin. Accra becomes the center of world revolution. The Ghana Revolution is viewed as the first such occurrence since the earliest years of the Russian Revolution. James, however, does not view Ghana as socialist in the strict sense, nor even as transitional to socialism. Rather, James's verdict is that Ghana experiences the application of a, quote, socialist pattern of society, end quote. The crucial factor left wanting is the technological basis necessary for socialism. In the U.S., James takes the organized movement of blacks also to function as a detonator for other local social movements. Now James offers enthusiasm for Castro. Like Trotsky, James lapses into the defense of some elected, quote, approximation, Like Trotsky, James lapses into defense of some selected, quote, approximations, end quote, to socialism, coupling this temporal position with an atemporal enthusiasm for abstract utopias. As in Trotsky, there is no explanation in James about how the transition between the concrete case is defended and the utopian end goal is to be achieved. James is clearly hostile towards the vanguard party principle of the later Trotsky, remaining closer to the younger Trotsky's arguments for proletarian self-activity. The major fact of modern politics for James is neither the party nor Stalinism, but the existence of the revolutionary proletariat. But transition for James remains a philosophical proposition projected onto history. In James's panologistic Trotskyism, history becomes the mere servant of a self-evolving reason. Dunayevskaya's theory is, in comparison, rather less extreme than this. Dunayevskaya on Trotsky, Lenin, and Luxemburg. Dunayevskaya's Hegelian Trotskyism is similar to James's, beginning with a preference for Lenin over Trotsky and ending in the state capitalist argument. Dunayevskaya's admiration for Lenin is even more fulsome than that of James, if somewhat more textually based. Dunayevskaya believes that it was Lenin's consideration of Hegel in 1914-16 which enabled him to produce in the April Theses the rationale for the October Revolution. In this understanding, Lenin did not accept Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. Trotsky's claims to the contrary notwithstanding. It was Hegel rather than Trotsky or any other influence who was responsible for Lenin's sensitivity to Russian circumstances, facilitating the Bolsheviks' consequent action upon them. Lenin's encounter with Hegel is given the status of an effective, quote, epistemological break, end quote, allowing Lenin's transportation from the reflectionism of materialism and imperial criticism to the more sophisticated position in the philosophical notebooks. Dunayevskaya ascribes a central importance to Lenin's Hegelian turn. Dunayevskaya argues that Lenin turned to Hegel in order to explain the contradictory developments prompted within the Second International by the Great War. According to Dunayevskaya, Lenin came to understand the counter-revolution within the socialist movement as a manifestation of the principle of the unity of opposites. Dunayevskaya projects the quote, philosophical end quote, Lenin of 1914 to 16 and the politically radical Lenin of 1916 to 17 backwards and forwards historically, glossing over the authoritarian elements in Lenin's theory and practice. Avoiding his espousal of the vanguard party, Dunayevskaya ascribes to Lenin her own position of mass self-activity. Such an ascription should not be surprising, for Dunayevskaya implicitly seeks to follow in what she sees as Lenin's footsteps. Her task is to provide the philosophical foundation for the new humanism requisite for socialist revolution through a fresh encounter with Hegel. In Dunayevskaya's view, the theory needed today must be set on a new philosophic foundation with a new concrete universal. Dunayevskaya's choice of universal is that which she ascribes to Lenin: every cook is to govern. Dunayevskaya agrees with James that Trotsky is inferior to Lenin on this score. Lacking an adequate philosophical basis, Trotsky could not make the leap into the realization that Russia was state capitalist, that the worker state had been transformed into the worker state's opposite. Dunayevskaya seems to understand Trotsky's fetishes of the party and nationalization less explicitly than James as the products of poor philosophical schooling. With reference to the problem of nationalization, Dunayevskaya contends that Trotsky's use of state property, a fixed particular, as a universal, produces a situation in which false universals are disconnected from the self-developing subject, (the working class). Trotsky universalizes the particular, state property, and avoids the, quote, labor of the negative, end quote, the thinking through of things. Both in theory and in practice, Trotsky was thwarted by his failure to follow Lenin and engage Hegel. Like James, Dunayevskaya has an unconscious empathy with the young Trotsky. Dunayevskaya avoids the arguments of the early Trotsky about the self-developing subject. Dunayevskaya's criticism of Trotsky rests on a simplification of Trotsky's actual positions. Dunayevskaya reduces the theory of permanent revolution to the theory of permanent revolution's early, pre-Bolshevik forms. Quote, theoretically, his, Trotsky's, whole life can be said to be a series of postscripts to these 1904 to 1906 theses, end quote. Trotsky's concept of the peasantry is not that of the self-developing subject. Trotsky fails to redevelop the universals of socialism in accordance with the newly developing objective situation, and therefore cannot place the peasantry in his fixed scheme. Trotsky remains caught in his view in his fixed position. If Dunayevskaya accepts the dominant image of Trotsky as Bolshevik and avoids his early arguments about the self-developing subject, then she has nevertheless all over the years come to identify more closely with the spiritual twin of the early Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg. The object of her most recent work, Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marx's Philosophy of Revolution, seems to relate the three subjects of her title, or as she would put it, to reveal their imminent connection in the theory and practice of permanent revolution. The absence of Trotsky from the title, if not the book, is significant. The implicit judgment is that his revolutionism is spiritually inferior to that of Marx or Luxemburg. Leaving aside here their substantial differences on questions like political economy, their political similarities are evident. Luxemburg and Dunayevskaya alike wished to see bourgeois society overturned by spontaneous social revolution. Luxemburg and Dunayevskaya's common refusal of vanguard organization, if not completely unambiguous, nevertheless indicates a shared reliance on the conventional wisdom of orthodoxy about the proletariat as the self-motivating actor who takes center stage in the next phase of world history. Dunayevskaya nevertheless criticizes Luxemburg, as Dunayevskaya does the other central revolutionaries of the period, for Luxemburg's refusal to produce a new philosophy of revolution. Dunayevskaya relates Luxemburg's, quote, mistakes, end quote, in political economy and over the national question to an insufficient consideration of dialectics, suggesting that Luxemburg saw philosophy, like revolution, as being the result of a spontaneous process of development. Luxemburg's theory and practice are, however, seen as expressing an intuitive understanding of the principles of Hegelian evolutionism. Luxemburg may not have dealt with Hegel in a theoretical register, but her contribution was nevertheless, quote, Hegelian, end quote. For her focus was not, like Trotsky's, on some false universal, but rather on the evolutionary principle of, quote, masses in motion, end quote. New section. Dunayevskaya on Hegel, Marx, and Socialism. Dunayevskaya agrees with James that the road to socialism leads through Hegel. Without a new universal and a new theoretical humanism built upon that new universal, the task cannot even be begun. Dunayevskaya takes dialectics even more seriously than James does. By dialectics is understood not only development through contradiction, but more so, development through absolute negativity. Dialectics is taken as shorthand for development, self-development, development through contradiction, development through transformation into opposites, development through negation and through double negation, negation of the negation. Dialectics is evolutionary by definition. Dialectics involves evolution from consciousness to philosophy, from primitive communism to freedom, from class struggle to classless society. But reality and thought for Dunayevskaya progressed through stages in correspondence. Marx's major work is seen as a manifestation of dialectical evolution. Quote, capital is the dialectics of bourgeois society, its development and downfall, end quote. Dunayevskaya argues that dialectics is not merely philosophy but life, a fact of life, which is to be acted out by the masses. Quote, of necessity we are propelled forward, not just to the first, but to the second negation, end quote. The core of Hegel's method for Dunayevskaya is the, quote, self-movement which is internally necessary because it is the way of the organism's own development, end quote. This was seen by Marx in the self-activity of the proletariat. Politics is understood to have an internal and necessary development. The principle of double negation is given the status of prime mover. It is negation rather than synthesis which is the principle of advance or creation. Dunayevskaya goes so far as to rebuke Adorno's suggestion, in negative dialectics, that Auschwitz marks absolute negation. Dunayevskaya refuses any proposal that the development initiated by negative dialectics could be retrogressive. Dialectics is inconceivable without teleology. Whatever the suffering engendered by passing negations, the historical direction of mankind is inevitably upward, towards socialism. The provider of this political dialectic, the abducted Hegel, Abducted, emerges here as something of a revolutionary. The argument is not altogether implausible. Hegel is presented as more revolutionary in effect than in intention. Dialectics explain Hegel rather than vice versa. The dialectic which Hegel uncovers overpowers Hegel's own intention. The argument seems reminiscent of Marx's 1859 preface, with the Hegelian dialectic standing in for the dynamic of the productive forces. A sense of necessity or destiny is pervasive in these images. Dunayevskaya links the present revitalization of the dialectic with the sharp upturn in Hegel studies on the 200th anniversary of Hegel's birth, and 100th of Lenin's, and with the political activism of George Jackson. I'm just going to read George Jackson's little Wikipedia introduction. George Lester Jackson was an American author, activist, and convicted felon. Serving an indeterminate sentence for stealing $70 from a gas station in 1961, Jackson became involved in revolutionary activity and co-founded the prison gang Black Guerrilla Family. In 1970, Jackson was charged, along with two other Soledad brothers, with the murder of correctional officer John Vincent Mills in the aftermath of a prison fight. The same year, he published Soledad Brother, The Prison Letters of George Jackson, a combination of autobiography and manifesto addressed to an African-American audience. The book became a bestseller and earned Jackson personal fame. Jackson was killed in prison by prison guards in 1971 during an escape attempt in which 3 prison guards and 2 inmates were killed. Back to the text. Dunayevskaya reads Hegel narcissistically. Hegelian verse is juxtaposed to the contemporary political event. Thus, for example, Hegel, the critic of Rousseau, is seen as a latent critic of the modern labor bureaucrat, while other Hegelian fragments are seen as incipient criticisms of Castro, Mao, Gillas, and Wright Mills. Quote, think of Mao and read the following, end quote. A fragment from the Phenomenology follows. True to character, the method of metaphorical juxtaposition here avoids the real meaning of both Hegel and Mao. In similar fashion, Hegel's logic is held to contain anticipatory criticisms of Khrushchev, Bukharin, and the Plan, while elsewhere Dunayevskaya has Hegel talking about the Paris Commune and the Soviets. The language of self-development circumscribes all these parallels. Hegel emerges again as the secret theorist of Marxism. The same logic which makes Lenin a philosopher now makes Hegel a revolutionary. Dunayevskaya uses the same formula as James to, quote, explain, end quote, the relation between Hegel and Marx. Marxism is the most idealistic of materialisms, while Hegelianism is the most materialistic of idealisms. Great emphasis is placed on the Hegelian dialectic of master and slave, and therefore on Marx's comments on the phenomenology. It's referring to the phenomenology of spirit in the Paris manuscripts, 1844, stressing the centrality of the category labor and the dialectic of negativity. Dunayevskaya is equally vulnerable, as is James, to the charge of falsely universalizing the dialectic of master and slave. James and Dunayevskaya follow Kojève's reading of Hegel, producing a Sisyphean teleology of, quote, progress through repetition. Alexandre, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Kojève was a Russian-born French philosopher and statesman whose philosophical seminars had an immense influence on 20th century French philosophy, particularly via his integration of Hegelian concepts into 20th century continental philosophy. As a statesman in the French government, he was instrumental in the formation of the European Union. The pivot of Dunayevskaya's Marxian Hegelianism is to be found in her ontology of revolutionary labor. Labor is held to be the defining category of humanity. Labor's opposite, capital, urges it into revolutionary activity, prompting a double negation. History as a whole is, for Dunayevskaya, the history of the development of labor. The evolution of man is envisaged as occurring through the stages of the developing labor process. As in James, so in Dunayevskaya does the vocabulary of evolution structure all images of the future. Dunayevskaya views man as a toolmaker striving toward human perfectibility through the revolt against capital. Indeed, man's natural mode of being here is revolutionary self-activity. Labor for Dunayevskaya is the overwhelming historical source of human identity. It is the binding constituent of history. Labor encapsulates the promise of human emancipation. Freedom or servitude of labor, therefore, becomes the crucial determinant in the classification of different forms of social organization. These sentiments are clearly steeped in the humanism of the young Marx. However morally positive her humanism may be, Dunayevskaya's own historiosophy is nevertheless reflected in her acceptance of Marx's insertion of his 1948 Politics, the class bipolarization and inevitable double negation of the Communist Manifesto, into his 1967 problematic in the penultimate chapter of Capital. Dunayevskaya's revolutionary optimism prevents the registration of the shift in Marx's project from revolutionary politics to structural analysis after the defeat of the 1848 revolutions. Imbued with the spirit of revolutionary inevitability, Dunayevskaya sees only the continuities and not the changes in Marx's trajectory. Dunayevskaya does not conceive of the project of Capital, the book, as an attempt to explain the ability of a resilient bourgeois society to achieve its own self-reproduction, because Dunayevskaya does not seem to recognize this key feature of its existence. So optimistic is Dunayevskaya's position that she presents instead a novel argument that Marx's Capital is the product of upsurge and class struggles rather than the consequence of their defeat. The elaborate argument is constructed on a parallel reading of Marx's 1859 contribution to the critique of political economy and Marx's 1867 Capital. Dunayevskaya takes the contribution to reveal the limits of a theoretical work written when the workers themselves are not in motion. Quote, Capital, on the other hand, is proof of the creative impact of masses in motion on theory, end quote. Dunayevskaya proceeds to construct the peculiar hypothesis that the American Civil War and the Paris Commune produced in Marx the ability to transcend the intellectual limits of his 1859 work. That Marx's problems in writing Capital were those of developing the form of systematic presentation rather than the lull in the class struggle is beyond that Marx's problems in writing Capital were those of developing the form of systematic presentation rather than the lull in the class struggle is beyond Dunayevskaya's ken. Here, Dunayevskaya turns a philosophical or methodological problem into a political problem. Like James, Dunayevskaya refuses to limit dialectics. Dunayevskaya effectively credits politics with the power of directly determining theory. The structure of Capital is therefore seen as emerging from the developing class itself. This conclusion results from Dunayevskaya's labor ontology. Marxism is now defined as a, quote, philosophy of labor, derived as naturally out of its own concrete struggles, end quote. New section. Dunayevskaya's theory of state capitalism and its outcome. Marx's most prescient political prophecy for Dunayevskaya was the, quote, prediction, end quote, that capitalism would develop into state capitalism, that the entire social capital would be united in the hands of one single capitalist or corporation. Marx is therefore seen as explaining not only the impending doom of the capitalist mode, but also as anticipating the capitalist mode's new totalitarian forms. totalitarianism is viewed as an effect of the essence of capitalism. The essence of labor power as a commodity is the defining characteristic of capitalism for Dunayevskaya. As in James's theory, so here the argument for Soviet state capitalism departs from the point of labor as it is experienced in the immediate production process. The state capitalist argument has its moral foundations in Dunayevskaya's interpretation of Marx's humanism, most notably in the priority given by young Marx to the laboring activity over its material result or product. Dunayevskaya's argument about the social character of the USSR is the obverse of Trotsky's. Property forms are taken to reflect production relations rather than determine them. Whereas for Trotsky, the existence of state property indicates the existence of socialism. For Dunayevskaya, the continued existence of production relations of domination indicates the existence of capitalism, with the difference that the function of the capitalist is performed collectively by the state. Trotsky's acknowledgement of the existence of, quote, bourgeois norms of distribution, end quote, in Russia actually indicates for Dunayevskaya the presence of that which he cannot accept, the existence of bourgeois methods of production. The USSR for Dunayevskaya is the site of the full, quote, satisfaction, end quote, of production, followed on later by historical repetitions in Eastern Europe and China. State power is defined here reductively as the power to dispose of the labor power of others. State power, that is to say, is defined as economic power. Russian state capitalism is viewed as the ultimate extension of Western capitalism. An extended definition and characterization of Russian state capitalism is offered in Dunayevskaya's major work, Marxism and Freedom. Dunayevskaya rejects the bipolarized scheme of, quote, market and, quote, plan. Market and plan are rather part of the same problem. The plan is a specifically capitalist form of organization. The planner functions as effective capitalist. The resulting class struggle between planner and planned does not differ in substance to the struggle between capital and labor. The dominance of the means of production department of the economy over the means of consumption department of the Soviet economy is symptomatic of state capitalism, Khrushchev's consumerist gestures notwithstanding. The increase in production of luxury consumption goods at the expense of mass consumption goods indicates that the existence of the Soviet ruling class can be established by its role in consumption as well as in production. The single outstanding peculiarity of Russian state capitalism is the existence of forced labor in labor camps, though it could be added that labor in general is neither geographically nor socially, quote, free, end quote. Further characteristics include the existence of piecework, Stakhanovism, and later, the application of the conveyor belt system. Piecework was finally legitimized by the Stalin Constitution with its maxim, quote, from each according to his abilities to each according to his work, end quote, while the Moscow show trials are taken to signal the consolidation of the new ruling class by clearing a place for it in the production process itself. The existence of Soviet state capitalism is given its final confirmation during the Second War, in the Stalinist expropriation of the vital parts of the first volume of Capital, and the corresponding official acknowledgement of the operation of the law of value in the USSR. For Dunayevskaya, the state capitalist counter-revolution is thus fulfilled within the revolution itself. As in James's writing, the schema involved suggests a paradoxically repetitionist philosophy of history. Stalin should, in Dunayevskaya's view, be seen as the perfect representative of counter-revolution because Stalin was, prior to the Russian Revolution, a real revolutionary. Stalin therefore personified the counter-revolutionary forces existing within the revolutionary movement from its earliest days. His power materializes only when the dialectic of forces within the revolution summons Stalin. The Mussolinis and Stalins alike represent objective forces in history. It is as though the forces of evil must be exhausted before capital R right can come. As though the forces of evil must be exhausted before capital R right can out. Socialism becomes conditional on defeat. History, as in James's theory, is seen as a field where the dialectical principle of unity of opposites works itself out, where no surprises occur to violate its preordained pattern. Only the order of things becomes more convoluted. If the USSR is the logical extension of the American experience, how then is American capitalism to be explained? Dunayevskaya argues that state capitalism is not a process of continuous development without breaks, but is rather a process of development through transformations into opposites. Though by no means identical twins, quote, America is beheaded in the same direction, quote, America is headed in the same direction as Russia, end quote, not beheaded. I'm a serial killer, it sounds like. This case is put the more emphatically because the view, quote, from below, end quote, is similar in Russia and America. Dunayevskaya cites the case of an American worker expected to operate two machines at the same time, a hallmark of the Eastern European labor process. In the U.S., wildcat strikes and black struggles are taken as major indicators of continuing class struggle. Proletarian revolution is in general held to be a, quote, historic necessity, end quote, as is crisis prompting capitalist collapse. The means by which the victims of Russian state capitalism are to overthrow the totalitarian regime are not specified, whether the law of motion of capitalism, indicating the growing reserve army of unemployed and falling profit rate, applies also to Russian capitalism is unclear. On all previous indications, it can be deduced that the double negation of capital, the allegedly inevitable, quote, expropriation of the expropriators, end quote, should apply to the USSR just as to the US. Like James, Dunayevskaya looks further afield in the search for the self-developing subject. She does not, however, settle on charismatic leaders as did James with Kwame Nkrumah. The West African and Cuban revolutions are portrayed as part of the humanist wave, but they eventually opt for one of the two poles of world capitalism, Soviet or American. Dunayevskaya takes a critical distance from Castro and Debré, enthusing instead for Fanon and Kosík, who together are viewed as applying Hegel coincidentally with the radicalization of the 60s. Régis Debray is a French philosopher, journalist, and former government official and academic. Debray is known for his theorization of theorization of mediology, a critical theory of long-term transmission of cultural meaning in human society, and for associating with Marxist revolutionary Che Guevara in Bolivia in 1967 and advancing Salvador Allende's presidency in Chile in the early 1970s. Debray returned to France in 1973 and later held various posts in the French government. I have actually, just let me read that last sentence. Dunayevskaya takes a critical distance from Castro and Debray, enthusing instead for Frantz Fanon and Karel Kosík, who together are viewed as applying Hegel coincidentally with the radicalization of the 60s. I have a Karel Kosík piece on here if you're interested. It's from the Socialist Humanism book that Erich Fromm put together in the early 60s. China, which like the USSR is neither socialist nor an oriental despotism but a state capitalist regime, is seen to be at risk because revolution and reason are energies inherent in the Chinese masses. Dunayevskaya is by no means lacking in international perspectives, but she does not turn away from the American situation. In contrast to James, Dunayevskaya's search for the revolutionary subject leads to a pragmatic identification of the forces of labor rather than a single shifting epicenter. As a result, rank-and-file workers, blacks, women, and youth are understood as the major socialist forces in the U.S. today. Here the problems of the transition to socialism are at least faced, even if they cannot be resolved because of the residual presence of Hegelianized notions of class. Inasmuch as classes are still conceived as self-developing subjects rather than as empirical groups composed of people with different interests, sometimes contradictory, Dunayevskaya's theory still rests on the teleological foundations common to all variants of, quote, automatic Marxism, end quote. As one reviewer of Philosophy and Revolution put it, Dunayevskaya, quote, seems to expect some orthogenesis in the development of social dialectics in human history, end quote. For all Dunayevskaya's devotion to the philosophical, quote, labor of the negative, end quote, the logic of Dunayevskaya's position leads her finally toward Trotsky after all, endorsing his fantastic claim that even the, quote, empiricism of a machine gun, end quote, cannot win against dialectics. New section. Assessment of the state capitalism argument and its explanatory adequacy. Despite their divergence and the differences in their ultimate conclusions, C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya follow the same path. Through a specific reading of Hegel to the argument about state capitalism and mass self-activity as the motive force alone capable of overthrowing it. Both textual and contextual evidence in Dunayevskaya's archive suggests that of the two, Dunayevskaya performed the more detailed analysis of Hegel, Marx, and the USSR. James and Dunayevskaya alike construct their view of state capitalism, quote, from below, end quote, from the view of the labor process as it is experienced on the shop floor itself. That the view, quote, from below, end quote, in the US and the USSR is the same is indeed a penetrating common sense and a real advance on Trotsky's own view. However, the view, quote, from below, end quote, understood in this way is purely phenomenological. The experience of work, quote, feels, end quote, the same. Yet even on the level of the shop floor, there are differences between East and West. An adequate analytical view of the nature of social regimes cannot be constructed, quote, from below, end quote, alone, as though East and West were simply identical. The point about structural differences between East and West brings us into direct confrontation with the state capitalist argument. The state capitalist argument identifies capitalism with modernity. The arguments of James and Dunayevskaya for, quote, state capitalism, end quote, are metaphorical or, in language closer to theirs, fetishistic, inasmuch as they make compulsory equivalents of the different. When Trotsky applies the concepts capitalism/socialism to the two major world powers, James and Dunayevskaya collapsed the US and USSR into the concept capitalism, maintaining socialism as a conceptual or imminent possibility. Neither Dunayevskaya nor James nor other state capitalists like Tony Cliff can explain Soviet-type societies in language other than analogical. What is peculiar and specific to these societies is therefore lost from the beginning, bathed in the ether of capital alone. The ultimate extension of this obliteration of difference can be seen in Dunayevskaya's simple dismissal of the market as epiphenomenal, and even more blatantly in her claim that, quote, purges, end quote, are a universal phenomenon produced by the capitalist mode of production, as though the dismissal of workers in the U.S. were of the same order as physical liquidation in the Moscow show trials. Extraordinary as Dunayevskaya's claim may seem, it is indicative of the conceptual expansion of capitalism. The dimensions of domination unique to the Soviet bloc are thereby reduced to manifestations of its allegedly capitalist mode of production. Fundamentally, to the state capitalist arguments in James and Dunayevskaya is the use of their most privileged category, labor. The ontology of labor, which both read into Hegel and Marx, as has been seen, is a positive ontology. History, despite and through throwbacks, progresses to socialism through the unfolding of the dialectic of labor. Sisyphus is really Prometheus. The unfolding of the dialectic of labor as a general philosophical proposition is held to have, as an accompanying immediate effect, the radicalization of the bearer or practitioner, the factory laborer, in East and West alike. The labor ontology, so basic to the state capitalist argument, is never worked up as such. It remains a first principle. Consequently, neither theorist explains the difference between work and labor, let alone the relation of labor to the separate sphere of social interaction. Indeed, the clarification of such differentiations must be avoided by the state capitalists, for their argument rests precisely on the association of, quote, labor, end quote, with, quote, praxis, end quote. To apply Alvin Goldner's differentiation, the notion of, quote, praxis, end quote, latent in a positive dialectic of labor has two different meanings. What Goldner calls, quote, praxis one, end quote, being the unreflective labor on which the reproduction of capitalism depends, while, quote, praxis two, end quote, indicates rather free labor directed toward the emancipation of workers from, quote, praxis one, end quote. The linguistic association of these two meanings is fundamental to the state capitalist presumption that manual labor has a redeeming revolutionary effect. Without this magical power, ordinary labor reemerges as what it is, and the socialist telos dissolves. The priority given to the category labor helps to explain the focus on the labor process, or the view, quote, from below, end quote, in Dunayevskaya and James. Both separate the category labor out from the conceptual constellation of capital, the book, avoiding Marx's extended definition of capitalist production as the generalized production of commodities, with labor itself functioning as a commodity, the extraction of relative surplus value, and the real subsumption of labor to separate capitals, whose share of the total social capital is realized through the market. A social formation cannot be characterized by that social formation's labor process alone. Obviously, for me, this is me talking. Obviously, the labor process can't be separated from the social formation as a whole. But I think this is a very actually apt sentence. It kind of hits the nail on the head for me. A social formation cannot be characterized by its labor process alone. Nor, back to the text, nor, in a broader sense, can social analysis ignore the defining character of the political processes which arise with different modes of production. The crucial instance in this case being the forms of liberal democracy, corresponding to the development of the capitalist market and mode of production which are totally absent in the Soviet bloc. Nor in a broader sense can social analysis ignore the defining character of the political processes which arise with different modes of production. The crucial instance in this case being the forms of liberal democracy corresponding to the development of the capitalist market and mode of production, which are totally absent in the Soviet bloc. Because of its single-minded focus on the labor process, the state capitalist argument reveals only the similarities, and occludes the process of clarification of the problems of the differences between the major industrial social formations and their overall historical direction. New section. Conclusion. James, Dunayevskaya, and Trotsky, and beyond. The privileging of the category labor and of the labor process overdetermines the political perspectives of the state capitalists. In James's case, the defense of contemporary African achievements is coupled to the notion of a syndicalist utopia where cooks might govern, the basic dynamics of which he sees is already enacted in the early days of the Soviet workers' state. James's deeper political affinities may lie with Lenin rather than Trotsky. James associates the early Soviet achievements with Lenin and seems more often to envisage Trotsky as the, quote, prophet outcast, end quote, than as the, quote, prophet armed, end quote. Dunayevskaya, in contrast, seems closer to Trotsky's abstract utopianism, where freedom is understood as a new form of existence beyond the world of production. Dunayevskaya even anticipates the abolition of labor, a mystical turn for her labor ontology. The notion, reminiscent of Trotsky's Literature and Revolution, that men and women might suspend the source of their very being, contradicts the entire labor ontology. Unless art is to be understood as the form of ontological labor appropriate to socialism. Perhaps the logic implied is that the redemptive double negation results in the transcendence of labor as such, but socialism would then entail the end of dialectics. Despite the absence of Trotsky's defense of the USSR and the addition of considerable philosophical sophistication, Dunayevskaya's and James's theory nevertheless fails to break through the limits of automatic Marxism. As in Trotsky, so in James and Dunayevskaya, the answer to the question of transition remains assurance, with the difference that where in the language of the Bolshevik Trotsky, it is history which drives men forward through the mechanisms of the party, in the state capitalist argument, it is capital M man who must drive history. Rhetoric there is, here, but of a different style. Man functions as a historical telos which progresses through its own unfolding. The anthropology of the, quote, state capitalist, end quote, thus culminates in a humanist determinism extending that of the young Trotsky. The problem is here is that rather than being too much like the Bolshevik Trotsky, they are too much like Marx or early Trotsky, not Jacobins. They are nevertheless automatic Marxists. The, quote, state capitalist, end quote, can therefore be seen as filling out Trotsky's Marxism as innovating on the basis of its limited achievements. The process of filling out the philosophical lacunae in Trotsky produces a situation more problematical than the original. James and Dunayevskaya alike associate politics with philosophy, or vice versa, rather than elaborating each separately. In comparison to Trotsky's hesitant and partial engagement of Labriola, Lafargue, Kautsky, and Plekhanov, their detailed forays into philosophy and in the philosophical in Marxism serve only to lead them further astray. They develop Trotsky's theory into a syncretic revolutionary totality, interpreting practice as theory and theory as practice. It is, however, their relative philosophical sophistication and their profound humanism which allows the, quote, state capitalist, end quote, to transcend the limits of Trotsky's own characterization of the USSR. Substituting the image of state capitalism for that of degenerated worker state, Dunayevskaya and James do not explain the structure of the Soviet regime beyond the analytical level of the labor process. Their argument, which might in fact be seen as the materialization of Trotsky's rhetorical premonition of state capitalism or bureaucratic collectivism in the, quote, USSR in war, end quote, produces a position no less hopelessly metaphorical than Trotsky's own, where Trotsky remains bound to the historic fact of the existence of the USSR and to the politics of leadership. Dunayevskaya and James find themselves working within a non-fulfilling humanist philosophy of history. The moral superiority and complexity of their arguments cannot serve to make the social explanation of the, quote, Hegelian Trotskyist, end quote, more adequate to the understanding of socialist politics. The practical superiority of their politics over Trotskyism's warrants emphasis, however. James's return to the concerns of his youth and his origins, while fascinating in themselves, take him outside the scope of this study into the specific problems of transition in the Third World. Such developments notwithstanding, is doubtless James's refusal of the vanguard principle, which is the binding thread of his politics, European and Pan-African. It is Dunayevskaya who emerges as both more stimulating and more problematical for our purposes. Dunayevskaya's insistence on the autonomy of struggle seems to allow a practical and strategic relativism, which is compromised only on the theoretical level by the syncretism of her labor ontology. Dunayevskaya recognizes the real diversity of social struggles, yet nevertheless subsumes them to the premise of a common striving of labor for autonomy. The array of contemporary struggles is therefore seen as an ultimate expression of geistige, quote, class struggle, end quote, anticipated by Marx rather than as a series of issue movements which are by nature incommensurate and interest-bound. Dunayevskaya therefore subsumes other struggles to those of labor. Black struggles become those of black labor, women's struggles of those of female labor. In Dunayevskaya's case, the political results break out of the conceptual premises within which they are constructed. Radical Trotskyism here again shares the grounding of the early Lukács in a labor ontology, a presumed automaticity, and the practical endorsement of Lenin. Unlike Lukács, however, both James and Dunayevskaya achieve a more worldly gaze on modern politics. This ambivalence remains the hallmark of their work. A radical yet ultimately ineffective politics emerges from orthodox philosophical premises. The views of the young Trotsky are thereby preserved, only the permanence of capitalist civilization vitiates them. The end. Sorry, I'm looking at the footnotes now. See if there's anything. I think this is all just stuff that I'll have to read on my own. Thanks for listening.